Today I'm reading from John 14, verses 12 through 14. Truly I tell you, the one who believes in me will also do the works that I do, and he will do even greater works than these, because I am going to the Father. Whatever you ask in my name, I will do it, so the Father may be glorified in the Son. If you ask me anything in my name, I will do it.
Thank you. It's the word of the Lord. And grab a seat. Today we're going to wrap up our 5-part Teach Us to Pray series, which drew its name from the request by Jesus' disciples in Luke 11. They come to Jesus, they see him praying, they see something in his prayer life and say, we want that. And as we talked about back in the first week of this series, Jesus' response, they say, teach us, and he doesn't really give them a teaching as much as he gives them a model prayer, the Lord's Prayer. He gives them a prayer to pray, and then teaches them about the correct posture in prayer. Throughout this series, that's myself and Matt Horn, who ably filled in for me last week, we've been trying to communicate these key truths in regard to prayer and spiritual formation and how this kind of works together. So I'll repeat these things one last time for you. 3 things. 1, spiritual formation is not just a Christian thing. Spiritual formation is a human thing. You are already becoming someone. You're already becoming a certain type of person, whether you know it or not. And so the question is whether you're becoming more like Jesus, and also whether or not you even know what's forming you. We talked about some of the primary forces that form us naturally back in week 1 of this series. Number 2, spiritual formation is not optional, but it is often unintentional. If we don't take an active approach in it, then we will be formed unintentionally. And so therefore, we need to discern the forces that are forming us. And then number 3, and this is where it really relates to prayer, our lives are going to be spiritually formed by something. So the invitation is for you to be formed by communion with the God who loves you and invites you into relationship with him. That's why we've been talking about the spiritual discipline or the spiritual practice of prayer. We want to encourage, challenge, and equip you to draw near to Jesus and experience all that he has for you. Back in the first week of this series, I defined prayer simply as talking with God, not simply talking to God or asking for things from God. But there is a reality to where when we think of prayer, we think of we're talking to God. We're asking God for things. And so I want to make sure that we take at least a week of this series to talk about that aspect of prayer. Today, we're going to discuss that aspect of prayer. And once again, just like I said a while back, we're not going to try to exhaust the entire this entire vast topic. I simply want to lay an invitation before you as it pertains to drawing near to God and asking him for things. Let's dive in. Let me start with a story. You likely heard about the Asbury University Spirit Outpouring back in February 2023. Raise your hand if you have an idea of what I'm talking about. There's a revival kind of thing that happened at Asbury. So what it was there was a regular chapel service that involved worship, teaching, prayer at Asbury University, and it just didn't end. Like it just kept going. The service kept going on for days and days with people praising God, with people confessing sin, praying together, being drawn into God's mission. From everything I understand, it was a pretty remarkable event, and it ended up lasting for 16 days. It was just a service that just kept going for 16 days. Pretty wild. I want to tell you about a prayer meeting that lasted a little bit longer. Okay? So let's start with a name. The name that you need to know for this is Count Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf. Okay? Who knows this name? Anybody? Anybody know this name, this person? Anybody? Okay. I didn't think this is a super well-known situation. So Zinzendorf was the son of a count. Later he became a count himself. From 18th century Saxony, that's in modern-day Germany, bordering Czechia. Who had a love for Jesus and a desire to do whatever God called him to do. In the early 1720s, a group of religious refugees ended up in his family's territory, and he allowed them to lodge on his family's estate in the village of Herrnhut. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but that's he allowed them to lodge there. That group over the next several years grew to about 300 people who attempted, as people that love Jesus, they attempted to live together and follow Jesus together. Now here's what you need to know about that group and those refugees. They loved Jesus, but several years in, it was not going well. There was strife and animosity and a generally negative spirit about their community. They'd become, instead of a bunch of people following Jesus together, what they'd become was a bunch of squabblers. They were just kind of arguing and not getting along. And the community, which came later to be known as the Moravians, lacked spiritual vitality. One day in May of 1727, and of course I'm way oversimplifying here, but one day in May of 1727, about 5 years into the experiment, the group decided to do something new. They decided, we're going to take prayer seriously. So they did, and miraculously, the Spirit of God showed up and kind of a mini revival broke out that summer in their community. By August, a few months later, the now spiritually alive community decided to covenant together in a bold commitment. Here's one way that commitment was remembered. Someone said, the thought struck some brethren and sisters that it might be well to set apart certain hours for the purpose of prayer, at which seasons all might be reminded of its excellency and be induced by the promises annexed to fervent, persevering prayer to pour out their hearts before the Lord. A lot of words there. Here's the translation. They started holding a 24-hour per day prayer vigil divided up into 1-hour increments that they would, kind of take time slots in. Almost immediately, once they started doing this, they developed a heart for missions, and they had folks rise up to be sent out as missionaries. And at the time, there were virtually no Protestant missionaries involved in cross-cultural missions. It just hadn't become a thing yet. And yet, within 5 years, the Moravians were sending out missionaries all over the world to places such as the West Indies, Greenland, Turkey, West Africa, South America, and the English colonies of Georgia and Pennsylvania. Zinzendorf himself became a missionary in Pennsylvania, where he founded the city of Bethlehem. And Moravian missionaries to Georgia played a key role in John Wesley's conversion and subsequent ministry. So maybe that's a name you know. But here's the key point. Here's where I'm going with this. They continued this 24-hour prayer meeting for 100 years. Just round the clock for 100 years. And the story of the Moravians and their legacy in missions, I think it reminds us that prayer, revival, and missions are often intertwined. The Moravians dedicated themselves to prayer for spiritual awakening, and God was faithful to answer that prayer. They also prayed for global missions, and God, in his providence, called upon several hundred of them to become the answer to their own prayers. The Moravians spread the gospel to unbelievers, they spread evangelical emphases to other believers, and they inspired generations of Christians to obey the Great Commission. And it all started with prayer. The story of the Moravians powerfully illustrates my main point for today. Here it is. This is what I want to communicate today. Prayer, especially in community, changes the world. Okay? We're going to examine this in two parts. So prayer changes the world, and then prayer is an activity best done in community. Okay, let's look at those. Prayer changes the world. Let me show you the biblical principle I'm working off of for this point, and then we're going to look at a biblical example of how we see this play out. If you have a Bible with you, I'd invite you to open to John chapter 14, the passage that Gina read for us just a few minutes ago. We're going to look at verses 12 through 14. This is Jesus in the upper room, after the Last Supper, as he's about to head to the cross. He's providing the disciples both the comfort and a vision for what things are going to be like after he's gone to the cross, resurrected, and ascended to be with the Father. So what's he say? Truly I tell you, the one who believes in me will also do the works that I do. And he will do even greater works than these, because I'm going to the Father. Whatever you ask in my name, I will do it, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If you ask me anything in my name, I will do it. The scripture could get a little spicy, but I think we're going to be okay. What is Jesus saying here? Well, first, he says, if you believe in me, you will do the works that I do. What works? I think usually when we come across that, we think of signs, we think of miracles. And I think that's right, but I think we need to think of it more broadly. I think, the works that Jesus did included things like teaching, like, evangelistic type of work. Yes, performing signs, but also things like caring for people, calling people into leadership, and so on. There's a lot going on in Jesus' ministry. But let's talk briefly about those signs. What should we take from them in relation to what Jesus says here? Well, signs are miracles that attest to Jesus' identity as the Messiah and the Son of God, and they're things that lead unbelievers to faith. So I would argue that when we talk about signs, when we talk about miracles in the ministry of Jesus, I believe two things. One, we should still expect them to happen, but I believe that we should expect them to generally occur in line with that purpose, that they would be both attesting to Jesus' identity as the Son of God and be involved in bringing unbelievers to faith. That, I think, is the point. If you think of a sign is pointing somewhere. That's the point of miracles. They point to Jesus and his identity, and they build up God's kingdom. And so if we think that the point in signs and miracles is to just get what we want, even if what we want is a good thing, then I don't think we're very likely to see signs. But I do think that signs still exist, and we could, if you're interested in that, we could look at kind of some of the stuff that's going on around the world in places where there's revivals that are going on, in places where it's like, it's just kind of some crazy stuff. There are signs and miracles and things going on in our world right now. Regardless, though, I think the real point here seems to be that if you believe in Jesus, you are to be utilized by God for the purposes of his kingdom. He also says here, though, and this is where maybe people kind of twist this a little bit. He says, you will do greater works. Again, in line with the purpose of signs and miracles, I would argue that these greater works are not likely to be bigger than Jesus' own works necessarily, but that they are going to be greater in terms of scope. That the greater works involves all those activities of Jesus' ministry, yes, signs, but also evangelism and teaching and deeds of mercy and compassion and all the rest. And I would argue that these works are greater, not because they're more amazing, that could happen, but I think that they're greater, more likely, because their scope is worldwide, and that they will result in the transformation both of individual lives and of whole cultures and societies. I think when Jesus talks about greater works, that's the direction it's pointing in. Then Jesus says that whatever we ask in his name, he will do it so that the Father will be glorified. What does that mean? Well, I think it means that when we ask God for things in line with the character and will of Jesus, that we should expect, or at least believe, that God will do it. Now, here's what that doesn't mean. That doesn't mean that adding in Jesus' name to the end of a prayer is like a magic incantation, where we say that and now God has to do it. That's not how it works. No, it simply means that effective prayer is going to be in line with what God is already doing. It's going to be in line with God's plan and purposes. And it's going to be things that Jesus delights in. And that's why he says in verse 14, if you ask me anything in my name, I will do it. If we ask for things in line with Jesus' character and will, if we ask for things in line with what Jesus delights in doing, then I think we can expect that at least believe that he will do those things. Now, certainly more can be said here, and I'm going to say a little bit more as we go, but let's illustrate this principle, this idea that prayer changes the world with a biblical story. If you have your Bible open, I'd invite you to turn to Acts chapter 12. I'm going the wrong direction. When we get to Acts 12, we are months or even years into the book of Acts. Kind of a side note here, but I would argue that the book of Acts, if you read it straight through, it reads like it's a really fast, like boom, 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 all these things happen. I think the book of Acts actually covers years, if not decades, of ministry. And so what we're getting is kind of this overview and some of the high points of things that happened over the course of decades. When we get to Acts 12, we're going to pick up in verse 4, just after King Herod Agrippa I, a grandson of Herod the Great, has had Peter arrested with the intent of executing him. Okay, we'll start in verse 4. After the arrest, he put him, Peter, in prison and assigned 4 squads of soldiers each to guard him, intending to bring him out to the people after the Passover. So Peter was kept in prison, but the church was praying fervently to God for him. So what's going to happen? Well, Peter has been arrested by Herod, who has murderous intent, and the church does the only thing they can. They gather and they pray. Okay, let's see what happens. Verse 6, when Herod was about to bring him out for trial, that very night, Peter, bound with 2 chains, was sleeping between 2 soldiers, while the sentries in front of the door guarded the prison. Okay, Peter's bound with 2 chains. He's also sleeping between 2 soldiers, plus there's sentries guarding the door. Okay, Herod is taking no chances here. There will be no jailbreak on this night. That's what's going on here. Let's keep reading. Verse 7, suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell. Striking Peter on the side, he woke him up and said, "Quick, get up." And the chains fell off his wrists. "Get dressed," the angel told him, "and put on your sandals." And he did. "Wrap your cloak around you," he told him, "and follow me." So he went out and followed. And he did not know that what the angel did was really happening, but he thought he was seeing a vision. So what happens? Well, as a result of the prayers of the church, an angel shows up to Peter. So first there's a light. Then the angel hits Peter on the side to wake him up. Apparently Peter, even though the night that it is not a good one, apparently he's out cold. Then the chains just fall off of Peter's wrists. And then Peter has to be told what to do. The angel's like, "Peter, put your clothes on. Peter, put your shoes on. Peter, put your jacket on. Peter, follow me." I feel like this is me talking to my kids when we're trying to go anywhere. All along, Peter thinks this is a vision. Okay, this is kind of a crazy scene, I think. It continues. Verse 10, after they passed the first and second guards, they came to the iron gate that leads into the city, which opened to them by itself. They went outside and passed one street, and suddenly the angel left him. So they walk right past 2 sets of guards, and then the iron gate that's locked and bolted shut, it just opens up. They walk out there in the street. The angel leads Peter another street away from the prison. Probably a good idea, because Peter still has no idea what's going on. And then Peter realizes, oh my gosh, this is real. Like, I'm actually on the street. Like I'm actually been set free. Okay? And so what does he do? Well, I love how this story kind of continues. Verse 11, when Peter came to himself, he said, "Now I know for certain that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from Herod's grasp and from all that the Jewish people expected." As soon as he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was called Mark, where many had assembled and were praying. Okay, naturally, when Peter comes to himself, he doesn't just stick around the prison to see if anybody will catch him, right? He hightails it to John Mark's mom's house, where there's lots of people gathered praying, like even in that moment, okay? And I think this is fascinating. So what are they doing? They're praying. What are they praying for? They're praying specifically for Peter to be set free. And then comes my favorite part of this story. Verse 13, Peter knocked at the door of the outer gate, and a servant named Rhoda came to answer. She recognized Peter's voice, and because of her joy, she did not open the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter was standing at the outer gate. They told her, "You're out of your mind." But she kept insisting that it was true, and they said, "No, it's his angel." So Peter is miraculously led out of the prison. He's still out on the streets. He's still kind of vulnerable, right? Like if a Roman soldier happens to walk by at this moment, they might be like, "Hey, what are you doing out here?" And he might go right back. And so when he gets to the house where the prayer meeting for his own freedom is going on, they don't let him in. They think that poor Rhoda is just, experiencing wishful thinking. They're like, Rhoda, calm down. That's not really happening. And so they end up having this whole conversation inside, back and forth. No, it's not really Peter. It's his angel. And Rhoda's saying, no, but I heard his voice. I know his voice. It's really him. He's out there. Now, to be fair to them, that sounds kind of crazy. To be fair, if they were to open the door and it's actually a Roman soldier, maybe not so good, right? Like there would be reason for them saying, no, we're keeping the door and the gates bolted shut just to be safe. It's the middle of the night. We're doing something that's illegal. We're not going to do that. But still, I think this is kind of humorous. Peter has literally been set free as a result of their prayers, and they won't let him into the prayer meeting. So meanwhile, what's Peter doing? Let's read one more verse. Peter, however, kept on knocking, and when they opened the door and saw him, they were amazed. Okay, he's still pounding on the door. He's saying, guys, I'm really out here. Don't let me get captured again. Says, maybe you wouldn't have such a happy ending if that's how this goes. And finally, they open the door and they're like, oh my gosh, it's really Peter. And they were amazed. Let me ask this. Why was Peter miraculously rescued? It's impossible to say for sure. But here's what we know. God's people gathered to pray for his freedom. And Peter went on to experience about 2 more decades of fruitful gospel ministry all over the Roman Empire. So it sure seems like Peter was rescued for at least 2 reasons. 1, because God's people prayed. Prayer changes the world. And 2, because Peter's rescue was in line with God's purposes in the world. This is why it matters that we believe that prayer changes the world. If we are to ever become a community that is committed to prayer, we need to believe it matters. We need to believe that prayer changes the world. And we need to believe that prayer is best done together in community. You notice that they're not all just like in their own homes praying. They're gathered together in John Mark's mom's house to pray for Peter. All throughout this series, we've been talking about the discipline of prayer and drawing near to God in prayer as an individual. And guys, please, if you take away nothing from this series but one thing, let it be this. Let it be that prayer, if it's not already, may that be a part of your daily rhythm of living. Okay, if it's not, I would encourage you, I implore you, figure that out. Wake up early, do whatever you need to do. Make spending time with God in prayer just a cornerstone of the way that you live your life. But I believe we'd be doing a disservice if we didn't talk about the importance of praying together with other believers. This is how, in history, both in the Bible and in Christian history, this is how we've seen the world be changed. So how does prayer change the world? Well, sometimes God changes the world by changing us and changing our hearts, bringing us into line with what he has for us. Sometimes God has a plan and a purpose, and by our praying, ultimately what happens is we get in line with God's plan. But sometimes, I really do believe, God waits for us to pray before he moves in a big way. I mean, consider the story of the Moravians. They sparked one of the great missionary movements in world history through consistent, fervent prayer. But why did God use them? Why did God pour out his Spirit on them? And why has God done that type of thing in various places and Christian traditions across Christian history? I think the answer is because prayer is best done in community. John Tyson, he's a pastor in New York. He's made himself into somewhat of an expert on the history of revivals. After much study on revivals, I heard him teach on this a while back. He said, he believes that there's one word that is the key to where God sends revival. And that word is hunger. And this is his phrase. He said, God comes where he's wanted. That's where revival happens. And so before we close up a series on prayer, I just want to ask, do we want God and his Spirit? Do we have a hunger for God? I think of the Beatitude from Matthew 5. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Do we want God to change us? Do we have a hunger and a thirst? Or are we kind of satisfied with things the way they are, or with the things of this world? And as a group, do we want God to change the world around us? Do we have a hunger to see God move? Or do we just think either, everything is fine, or maybe we think that our prayers don't actually matter that much, and maybe God's going to do whatever he's going to do already? You see, if we believe that prayer changes the world, and if we believe that God responds to people who are committed to seeking his face, then we ought to become a people of spiritual hunger. We ought to desire to see Jesus himself and be satisfied by him and him alone. Revival always features prayer centered on a fervent desire for God himself. You can read through the history of revivals, and we see that over and over again. That's why we've seen revivals in everything from the Presbyterian tradition to the charismatic Pentecostal tradition to the Pietist tradition like the Moravians, and everywhere in between. There's not a rhyme or a reason to where God's Spirit is poured out except that God comes where there's actually hunger. God does not force himself upon us. And ultimately, God does not primarily desire to give us our desires in prayer. He primarily desires to give us himself. And that's been the whole point of this whole series. I want you to know God and experience the love of God and to be formed into a person marked by that love. I deeply believe that becoming a community desperate for the face of God, desperate to see God move in the world around us and change the world is how we're going to become that kind of people. Now, before we wrap up with some invitations and some things to step into, I want to deal with an uncomfortable reality when it comes to prayer that we see on display in Acts 12. Like even, this goes back to what I was talking about from John 14. Jesus says, I will do it and all this stuff. What do we do with unanswered prayer? Let's go back and read the first two verses of Acts 12, right before that miraculous rescue of Peter that we just looked at. Verses 1 and 2. About that time, King Herod violently attacked some who belonged to the church, and he executed James, John's brother, with the sword. Period. So for Peter, they have an all-night prayer vigil, and in the middle of the night, an angel shows up, takes Peter out of prison, and Peter shows up at the prayer vigil. But what about James? He was also arrested. I would be shocked if they didn't also have an all-night prayer vigil for him. And yet he was executed and became the first of the 12 apostles to die. Why? Peter was going to go on to have decades of fruitful gospel ministry. John, James's brother, lived for many decades and had fruitful gospel ministry. In fact, with John, they tried to kill him by boiling him alive, couldn't do it, stuck him on an island, and then he just keeps writing letters to spur on the church in the midst of persecution. But James, I mean, think about it. Jesus' core three, Peter, James, and John. James was arrested and he was killed. He was just run through with the sword. And he died. The end. He didn't take the gospel to some faraway country. He didn't write letters that became books of our Bibles. He didn't become the leader of a church. He just died. Even though he was one of those three. And even though God's people must have been praying. Why? I think this is a really hard truth when it comes to prayer, but I think we need to be honest about it. Why was Peter rescued? Because God moved in response to prayer. It's the only real answer we can give. Why was James not rescued? I don't know. And maybe that's unsatisfying. But I think when we're going to come before God, we need to both have the boldness to ask and believe that God can do anything. And that he will, if it's in line with his will. And yet also to be able to hold it open-handed and say, God, I give this to you completely and I trust you. See, I think Acts 12 is on the one hand, it's incredibly unsatisfying, and then it's incredibly miraculous. And sometimes that's the way it goes in prayer. Why do our prayers sometimes get answered and sometimes go unanswered? There's a lot of reasons. Sometimes prayer is unanswered because we need to change. Sometimes we pray wrongly. Sometimes it's just a function of God's patience with a broken world. He lets brokenness go on, even though we can't imagine why God would allow a certain thing to continue. Sometimes we need to be reminded that God is the potter and we're the clay. Sometimes we just need to be persistent. And sometimes I really do believe that it just doesn't make sense. And yet, despite that mystery, we must believe that prayer, especially prayer in community, has a real effect on the world around us. And we've got to believe that if we're going to become a people of prayer. Now, that's kind of a low note, so let me bring us back up to one more high note as we finish. Let's go back to the idea of revival. One example we can find of revival, or at least something close to it, is in the ministry of 19th century English Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon's ministry. Spurgeon was known as the Prince of Preachers, and he had incredible oratory skills, and it's not an exaggeration to say that thousands of people came to Christ through his preaching. But Spurgeon never took credit for the success of his ministry. Instead, he always pointed to the hundreds of people who came and prayed for God's blessing before and during his services. Spurgeon was often fond of calling these prayer gatherings the church's boiler room, which in that day, boiler rooms were the driving forces of everything from vast machines and factories to household heating systems. Boiler rooms were not pleasant places to be. They were functional, dirty, and hot, and they were often tucked away in the basement. And yet Spurgeon always claimed that the key to his ministry, why did God use my ministry? Spurgeon would say, because my people prayed in the boiler room. Like all spiritual disciplines, I believe that prayer is best done together. You can engage in disciplines alone and occasionally check in with others, but it's best done together. So, I'm going to close and offer you this week's invitational practice. Simply put, it's find a way to consistently pray in community. That's the bottom line. I strongly encourage you to find at least 1 to 2 people to pray with in such a way as to believe that prayer changes things. That said, here are a few ways that we want to equip you to do that. First off, we have small groups, and our small groups aren't necessarily built around simply gathering to pray. However, I would ask you and encourage you, if you're in one of those, have prayer be a part of that. At the minimum, have a way for sharing prayer requests and for checking in on one another. I think that's kind of a good baseline thing. Here's my encouragement about prayer time, especially if you're able to have those in your small group meetings. Don't just pray for the needs of those in the group. Pray for those, absolutely, but also pray for mission and pray for God's presence. Pray that you'd become people of peace. Pray that you would be salt and light. Pray that God would show you your next steps of obedience, and pray for specific people and environments. Small groups is a good place where we can begin to step into prayer together. Here's another one. We actually have a prayer room right here in the church. It's in the back hallway in kind of the kids area of the church. But here's the thing. I would invite you to use it. At some point, we may be able to set up a prayer team to pray before or during services, kind of like Spurgeon's boiler room prayer meetings. But at this point, I just want you to know there's a room. It's in the back of the church. It's a physical space that is there, and it's available to you. You're welcome to use it on Sundays. You're welcome to come in during the week and use it if you'd like. As a practical note there, if you want to come in during the week, maybe reach out and make sure somebody will actually be here to let you in the building. But you're welcome to use it. It's there. Thirdly, what if you have a prayer request you'd like to communicate to the church? We actually had something like that go out earlier this week. We're still figuring out some of the details on how can we do this best and all that sort of thing. But please, I would ask you, reach out. A great place to start would be to reach out to Abby Weigel, our administrator. Abby can send out a prayer request on the weekly update email. She can put it in there. She can also send out a quick email blast, put it on our private church Facebook group. Again, there was something that went out earlier this week. I hope you saw it. I hope you prayed. It sounds like the reports on that one are actually positive as of the last I heard. That said, I do deeply believe that praying together matters. And so in addition to all of that, you're invited to stop in, to be prayed for. You can, one thing that if you're open to this, you submit a prayer request, we can share that with our small group leaders. And say, hey, in your group, the next time you gather, pray for this. Pray for this person or this situation or whatever. And know this, when at the end of services, a lot of times I'll say, hey, if you want to be prayed for, if you want to talk more, I mean that. I would love to talk more or to pray. I would love it if you would, come forward and ask to be prayed for or catch me or someone in the lobby. And just know, too, if you reach out to me, if you tell me something, even if it's just you're on your way out the door and you want to tell me something, please know, I will be praying for you. And if you ask me to pass it along to other people in the church, I will. I'll probably ask you who you want me to pass it along to, but I would love to do that. One last thing I'll point to is we have prayer services here. At least 3 times a year, we're going to have a service that's specifically devoted to prayer. The next one will be the first Sunday in January. We'll give more details on that a little bit later. And lastly, and this is a lot, but man, I really think this matters. Here's a new thing that we want to roll out. We're going to start a strategy to have prayer warriors for the children in our church. And this is going to be something specifically for our members. And so if you want to know more about membership, you can ask me and I can fill you in on that. And this is also going to be something that's going to be totally optional. And we're still figuring out some of the logistics on it. But we would love to pair up some of our adult members with the kids of members in the church to just pray for them and come alongside the families of those kids and encourage them. And, if there's anything specific that they can do to be a point of contact. So if you're a member, before too long you hear more about this. We're still smoothing out some of the logistical details about how to do this best. But I think it's something that'll be pretty cool over a long period of time. As we bring this prayer series to a close, let me state one more time. Prayer is mysterious. I do believe that there's mystery to it. And it's primarily aimed at bringing us closer to God. But I really believe that the main point from today, that prayer in community changes the world. Let's pray. Dear God, give us yourself, give us your Spirit. Lord, give us that humility that is going to be required for us to actually want to seek you. Give us a desire to see the world change. Lord, give us a hunger for you, a hunger for your face. God, I pray that you would shape us, mold us to be a group of people who are committed to you and to seeing what you have for us. And yes, to seeing the world around us change, but in the process of just becoming people that are more like you and experiencing all that you have for us. Amen. Well, in bringing our service to a close, we're going to respond with a